Chapter 1. The disappearance at the wedding was a picture-perfect summer's day in the village of Cranley St. James, the kind of day that seemed plucked from a charming postcard. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the quaint cottages, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oaks lining the village green. The village was bustling with activity as preparations for the wedding of the year took place at the local church. The bride, Lady Eleanor Waverley, was the daughter of the wealthy and well-regarded Lord and Lady Waverley. The whole town had been swept up in the excitement, with the tea shop overflowing with guests enjoying delicious scones and homemade jam, and the florist's van parked in front of the church, unloading the last of the flowers. The church bell rang just before noon, heralding the hour when the marriage ceremony would begin. Among the guests was Miss Marple, the village's most quiet, unassuming resident, who had been invited as a family friend of the Waverlys. Though Miss Marple was a gentlewoman of a certain age, her mind was as sharp as ever, and she had always had a knack for noticing things others missed. She had been sitting in the back pew, knitting quietly as the ceremony began, when a low murmur rippled through the congregation. It wasn't the typical whisper of admiration for the bride's dress, nor was it about the floral arrangements. No, the murmur that spread through the church was one of disbelief. Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the front of the church, where Lady Eleanor's bridal party was gathered, smiling and chatting amongst themselves. Then she noticed one of the bridesmaids was missing. It was Maggie Ellis, a quiet young woman who worked as a shop assistant at the local dressmaker's. Maggie had always kept to herself, preferring the simplicity of her life in Cranley St. James to the hustle and bustle of the larger towns. She was a last-minute addition to the bridal party, having been invited only a few weeks before the wedding. But she had become a beloved part of the group, and everyone had expected her to be one of the shining stars of the day. The whispers started immediately. Some thought she had simply gone to fetch something, perhaps a forgotten accessory, while others speculated that she might have slipped out to avoid the attention of the guests. Lady Eleanor appeared at the front, looking radiant as she took her place, but the absence of her bridesmaid didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. The air shifted slightly, as if the perfect day had suddenly lost its luster. The church service went on, but the gossip was unavoidable. By the time the vows were exchanged and the happy couple was pronounced married, the question of Maggie's disappearance was on everyone's lips. After the ceremony, Miss Marple lingered at the back of the church, watching as the guests made their way out to the reception. She could see the concern etched on the faces of the wedding party, most notably Lady Eleanor, who was chatting with the vicar. It didn't take long before a search party was organised, but the bridesmaid's absence remained a mystery. Later, that afternoon, as the reception unfolded at Waverley Hall, Miss Marple took a subtle walk around the edges of the grounds, watching the other guests celebrate, but keeping her attention focused on the situation at hand. The smell of freshly baked bread and the sound of laughter filled the air, but Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. She found herself near the hedgerow at the far end of the estate, her sharp eyes noticing small signs that others might have missed. There, in the tall grass, a piece of lace fabric caught her attention, a corner of what seemed to be a bridesmaid's dress. Miss Marple knelt, gently picking it up, running her fingers over the delicate fabric. It seemed so out of place as though it had been hastily torn away and discarded. A shadow passed overhead, and Miss Marple looked up to see Inspector James Bryce, a young man who had recently moved to the village, walking briskly toward her. He had a keen mind, but was still somewhat unfamiliar with Miss Marple's more discreet methods of investigation. "Miss Marple, I was hoping I would find you here," Bryce said, his face furrowed with concern. "Have you seen anything unusual?" Miss Marple rose slowly, her gaze shifting from the piece of fabric in her hand to the young inspector. "Nothing that stands out, but there's always something to be learned from what's left behind, Inspector. It's the small details that matter most." He followed her gaze to the fabric in her hand, his eyes narrowing. "This belonged to one of the bridesmaids, didn't it? Maggie Ellis, I think." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. "Yes, this is definitely hers. But why would it be out here on the ground?" The inspector glanced over his shoulder, looking uncertain. "I have no idea. We've searched the grounds, asked the family and the staff, but no one's seen her since just before the ceremony." Miss Marple looked back at the reception, her expression thoughtful. "The question isn't where she went, it's why. Why did Maggie Ellis vanish from the wedding?" As the investigation unfolded, Miss Marple took careful note of the reactions from the wedding guests. They were all polite and respectful, but the deeper she looked, the more she realized that everyone had their own secrets. The bride herself, Lady Eleanor, seemed genuinely concerned but also somewhat distant, as though a certain restlessness had overtaken her. Her family, rich and powerful, were too perfect, as though they had something to hide. But it was the bridesmaids who seemed to know more than they were letting on. Maggie's absence was unsettling, but there was a certain nervousness that was becoming more evident with each passing moment. Miss Marple found herself drawn to Jessica Lawrence, one of the bridesmaids who had been closest to Maggie. Jessica had been her best friend, and had often been seen with her throughout the preparations for the wedding. Now Jessica seemed quiet, her cheeks flushed with a hint of guilt. "Miss Lawrence," Miss Marple said as she approached her later, "that evening, I hope you'll forgive me for asking, but can you tell me what happened earlier today? You were very close with Maggie, weren't you?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the garden. "Maggie, she's a good girl. We've been friends for years. I don't know why she's gone missing." Miss Marple tilted, her head slightly, her expression gentle but sharp. "Perhaps you can help me understand. What exactly happened before the ceremony? Did anything seem unusual?" Jessica hesitated, her fingers twisting the delicate lace on her gown. "No, everything was fine. We were all excited, you know. But Maggie seemed distant. She looked at Lady Eleanor, and she had this look on her face, like she was upset. But she wouldn't say anything to me. She just walked off." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her mind already working. "And you didn't think it strange at all? Maggie just disappearing like that, without a word?" Jessica shook her head quickly. "I didn't know where she went, but I assumed she was just nervous. She had that way about her. She didn't like crowds. She might have needed a moment alone." Chapter 2. The Web of Secrets. The village of Cranley St. James was accustomed to peaceful routines, and its residents were not accustomed to anything so out of place as a missing bridesmaid on the day of the wedding. The delicate fabric of tradition and order had been torn, and the aftermath was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As the evening wore on, the reception continued at Waverley Hall, but the missing bridesmaid remained the talk of the evening. The bride, Lady Eleanor, had been charming as always, her beauty radiating beneath the warm glow of chandeliers, but there was something off in her eyes, a subtle tension that couldn't be ignored. For the first time that day, Miss Marple noticed how her usual poised demeanour had slipped, the smallest frown appearing at the corner of her lips when no one was looking. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidence, especially in matters of crime. She knew that the truth would always reveal itself to those who knew how to listen. So, when the last of the guests began to filter out, Miss Marple stayed, as she often did, to observe the people who remained. Miss Marple was seated near the back of the reception hall, her knitting once again in her lap, though her mind was focused intently on Lady Eleanor. She had always admired the young woman from afar, appreciating her grace, her intelligence, and her sharp wit. But tonight Miss Marple had seen enough to understand that something was not quite as it seemed. Lady Eleanor had been speaking with her family at the far end of the room when Miss Marple saw her hesitate, her hand clutching the edge of the table. The smile on her face faltered, and for a brief moment her eyes darted towards the door, a look of concern washing over her features. Without thinking, Miss Marple moved closer, her quiet footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. She had learned long ago that sometimes the smallest gesture or the briefest glance could reveal more than a conversation could. She approached Eleanor slowly, allowing her to speak first. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice tight but cordial, "I hope you've been enjoying the festivities." "I have indeed, dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but intentionally probing. "But I can't help but wonder if there's something troubling you. Is everything quite all right, Liclantour?" Hesitated for a moment before letting out a small laugh, though there was no mirth in her expression. "Oh, it's nothing really. Just a bit of nerves, I suppose. My bridesmaid, Maggie, she stopped herself abruptly. Her hand tightening on the edge of the table, Miss Marple watched her closely, her blue eyes sharp with observation. "Maggie?" she asked, her voice soft, as though she were trying to coax the girl to continue. "What's happened to her?" Eleanor blinked rapidly, as though trying to push away the thoughts that were clearly weighing on her. "She's simply missing," Eleanor said, her voice betraying the fragility beneath her calm facade. I think she's just hiding somewhere. She's always been a bit nervous around crowds." Miss Marple studied her carefully, taking in every detail of the young woman's expression. Eleanor's hand was still pressed firmly against the table, and her gaze flitted back to the door once more. This was no simple case of nerves. Miss Marple could sense that the truth was slipping between the cracks, that something was being kept from her. Eleanor's discomfort seemed more than simple anxiety, more than an off-handed remark about a bridesmaid who had gone missing in the chaos of a wedding day. There was a depth to this disappearance that was more than the eye could see. It, very unlike Maggie to slip away unnoticed," Miss Marple said quietly. "Has she been in touch with anyone today? Perhaps a note or a message?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked like she might have spoken, but the words died on her lips. She glanced at the door again before looking back at Miss Marple, her expression suddenly guarded. "No, there's nothing," she said, her voice barely audible. I'm sure she'll turn up. I'm sure of it." Miss Marple nodded slowly, but the glint in her eyes was hard to miss. She had a feeling that this was far from over, and she knew that she would need to dig deeper into Maggie's past to uncover the truth. The evening wore on, and the guests began to leave, the last strains of music fading into the night. Miss Marple quietly observed the remaining few, wondering if one of them might know something more about the bridesmaid's disappearance. She was drawn to Jessica Lawrence, the bridesmaid closest to Maggie. Earlier in the day, Jessica had been seen, with Maggie laughing, chatting, and it seemed they were inseparable. Now, as Jessica stood near the back, her eyes darting nervously from one person to another, Miss Marple knew this was a moment for a delicate approach. Miss Marple made her way over to Jessica, who stood alone near the reception's exit. Her face was pale, her hands clenched in front of her. She was trying to appear composed, but Miss Marple could tell that something was gnawing at her. "Jessica," Miss Marple greeted warmly, her voice full of gentle inquiry. "I do hope you don't mind my asking, but is everything all right? I couldn't help but notice that you seemed rather concerned earlier when I spoke with Lady Eleanor about Maggie." Jessica stiffened at the mention of Maggie's name, her eyes flicking nervously to the side. "Maggie, she's been acting strangely," Jessica admitted softly. "She seemed distant this morning, didn't join the others when we were getting ready for the ceremony. I thought maybe she was just feeling a bit off, but now you think something more is at play," Miss Marple finished for her. Jessica swallowed, her eyes welling up. I don't know what's happened. She seemed upset about something to do with Eleanor, I think. She said something about the wedding being a mistake, about how it wasn't what she thought it would be." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Eleanor again. That was where the key seemed to lie. And did she say why she felt this way? Was there a reason? Jessica hesitated, her hands trembling. She was worried about Eleanor's future, Jessica whispered. She said she couldn't be part of it, that she couldn't be involved anymore. She wanted to leave. Miss Marple nodded slowly, taking in Jessica's words. Something was definitely amiss. The emotional turmoil between Maggie and Eleanor seemed to be the root of the mystery. But the question was why? What had Maggie discovered that made her flee before the wedding? "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "Thank you, Jessica. I think I may need to look into Eleanor's past a bit more closely." Jessica looked at her with a mixture of fear and relief. "I hope you find out what happened, Miss Marple. I just want Maggie to come back." Miss Marple smiled kindly but firmly. "I will, dear, I promise. But there's one thing I know. This is far from over." Chapter 3. The secrets beneath the surface the following morning dawned clear and bright, a gentle reminder that the village of Cranley St. James would continue with its quiet routines, despite the shadows of uncertainty cast by the missing bridesmaid. The wedding, the talk of the village for weeks, was now overshadowed by a mysterious disappearance, and yet no one seemed willing to admit that there was more to it than a mere wedding day mishap. As usual, Miss Marple's morning was spent quietly, in her cottage, sitting by the window and knitting. But today, her thoughts were more focused on the clues she had gathered. Maggie Ellis's unease, her sudden disappearance, and the troubling behaviour of Lady Eleanor. Everything seemed connected, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth before the village moved on, leaving the mystery to be swept under the rug. The sharpness of her observations had never failed her in the past, and she knew that this time was no different. She had a clear picture of what had happened the night before, and now she was ready to piece the story together, one small detail at a time. But the puzzle pieces were scattered, and she needed to dig deeper into the hidden lives of the people involved. Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to Waverley Hall, the home of Lady Eleanor and her parents, Lord and Lady Waverley. The Fulshire house was an imposing structure, tall and elegant, nestled at the edge of the village. Waverley Hall was known for its grand gardens and impeccably maintained grounds. But Miss Marple's focus was not on the beauty of the estate today. She had one goal: to speak with Lady Eleanor and learn more about the strange connection between the young bride and her missing bridesmaid. Miss Marple knew that Lady Eleanor had been feeling the weight of expectations, not just from her family, but from the village as well. The pressure to marry well, to live up to the legacy of her family, was not a light burden, and Miss Marple suspected that there was more to Eleanor's nervousness than simply missing a bridesmaid. As Miss Marple entered the drawing-room, she was greeted by Lady Eleanor, whose composed exterior had slightly cracked since the previous day. Eleanor stood near the window, her hand resting on the sill as she gazed out at the sprawling gardens. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Eleanor said, though her tone lacked the usual warmth. She seemed distracted, her eyes shifting restlessly. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the quiet understanding that had come from years of observation. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Lady Eleanor. I simply wish to check in on how you are holding up after such an eventful day." Eleanor forced a smile, but there was a hint of unease in her posture. "Oh, I'm fine. It's just everything has been so overwhelming, and Maggie's disappearance has left me, well, I don't know what to think any more." Miss Marple sat across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Of course, the missing bridesmaid is most certainly troubling, but there's something else that I can't help but wonder, Lady Eleanor. You seemed so distant last night, something in your manner. It was as though there was something weighing on your mind." Eleanor's face tightened at the question, but she quickly regained her composure. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple, ever so gentle, allowed her eyes to linger on Lady Eleanor, her voice low and understanding. "I'm not implying anything, dear, but I think you know as well as I do that the truth often finds its way to the surface, even when we'd prefer it stayed hidden." Eleanor's face paled slightly, her eyes darting around the room as though looking for a way to escape the conversation. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. Perhaps you've been too caught up in this mystery." Miss Marple watched her carefully, the unspoken tension thick in the room. She could tell that Eleanor was hiding something, whether it was a fear, a guilt, or perhaps a secret she was afraid to reveal. "I do understand, dear," Miss Marple said with a soft smile, "how overwhelming it can be when things are out of your control. But sometimes the answers are right in front of us, waiting for us to see them." Later that day, Miss Marple visited Maggie Ellis's home, a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. Maggie's absence had left a hole in the festivities, and Miss Marple knew that the answers to the mystery lay somewhere within her past. Maggie's cottage was empty, with no sign of the young woman. The door had been left slightly ajar, and Miss Marple stepped inside, her keen eyes scanning the small living room. There were books scattered on the table, a quilted throw across the armchair, and a small vase of flowers on the windowsill, all signs of the life Maggie had lived until now. Miss Marple walked over to the table and picked up a small letter that lay there. It was folded neatly, with the name Eleanor Waverley scrawled in Maggie's handwriting. Miss Marple opened it carefully, reading the contents with quiet determination. Eleanor, I cannot do this any more. The weight of everything is too much, and I can no longer pretend to be someone I'm not. I wish you well, but I must leave. Please understand. Yours, Maggie. The words were simple, but they spoke volumes. Maggie had been running from something, and whatever it was, it had been tied to her connection with Eleanor Waverley. Miss Marple folded the letter back carefully, considering the implications. Maggie had disappeared, but she hadn't gone far. There was something that had driven her to leave, and that something was rooted deeply in her relationship with Eleanor. As Miss Marple stepped out of Maggie's cottage, a new realization began to take form in her mind. She had expected the mystery to be about jealousy, perhaps some hidden rivalry or unresolved conflict. But now she was convinced it was something much darker. Eleanor and Maggie's relationship was far from simple. It was a relationship built on secrets, betrayal, and hidden truths. And Miss Marple had a feeling that the truth was about to come to light. She made her way back to the village, her thoughts swirling. The next step in the investigation was clear. She needed to speak to more people who knew Eleanor and Maggie, people who might have seen the cracks in their friendship, and who might know what had really caused Maggie to run away. Miss Marple's mind raced, knowing that time was of the essence. There was more to this story than anyone had imagined, and she was ready to uncover it all. Chapter 4. Beneath the Surface. The following day, the village of Cranley St. James woke with a sense of quiet anticipation. The wedding celebrations had long since faded into memory, and yet the air remained thick with uncertainty, as though something still lingered just beneath the surface. Miss Marple spent the morning taking her customary walk along the village lanes, observing the small shifts in behaviour that others would overlook. As always, the townspeople greeted her with warm smiles, but their eyes betrayed a quiet nervousness, a palpable discomfort that hung in the air. Gossip swirled like the wind, and Miss Marple knew that the disappearance of Maggie Ellis had left more than just an emotional scar. It had opened a door that no one in the village could quite close again. Her thoughts, however, were fixed firmly on the growing web of secrets she had begun to unravel. Maggie Ellis's abrupt departure was tied not only to her relationship with Lady Eleanor, but to something darker, something hidden within the very heart of the Waverley family. Miss Marple had already spoken with Jessica Lawrence, the bridesmaid who had been closest to Maggie. But Jessica's vague explanations had only served to deepen the mystery. Maggie had been unsettled, distraught even, and that was before her sudden disappearance. Yet no one seemed to know the real reason why Maggie had decided to leave. Miss Marple had one task left, to speak with the people who had known both Eleanor Waverley and Maggie Ellis for longer than anyone else. The staff at Waverley Hall, in particular, might have witnessed something that the family and friends had overlooked. Miss Marple had an inkling that the key to this entire mystery lay in the unspoken history of Eleanor and Maggie, a history that likely stretched back years, long before the wedding had even been planned. As she made her way to Waverley Hall, she found herself wondering what secrets the Waverley family had hidden for so long. She entered through the back entrance, where she was greeted by Mrs. Bates, the Waverleys' housekeeper. Mrs. Bates was an elderly woman with a sharp mind, though her stooped shoulders and slow, careful movements suggested she had been in service for many years. Her face softened when she saw Miss Marple, and she led her into the drawing-room, a place where the Waverley family entertained only the most important guests. "Miss Marple, it's always a pleasure to see you," Mrs. Bates said, her voice polite but tinged with weariness. "How can I assist you today?" Miss Marple took a seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I'm afraid I must trouble you, Mrs. Bates. I've been investigating the disappearance of Maggie Ellis, and I'm wondering if you might have seen anything unusual, or perhaps heard anything that might help me understand the situation better." Mrs. Bates blinked in surprise, her face turning pale for the briefest moment before she regained her composure. "Maggie? Well, I do know that she was, quite upset the night before the wedding. She kept to herself, as she often did, but what with the wedding preparations, I didn't think much of it. The bride was under a great deal of pressure, and I assumed Maggie was simply stressed as well." Miss Marple nodded, though she was certain there was more to the story. "But was there anything else? Any sign that Maggie and Lady Eleanor were, let us say, at odds?" Mrs. Bates hesitated, her gaze flickering to the door as if she were concerned someone might overhear. But she lowered her voice and said quietly, "There was something I noticed the day before the wedding. I overheard a conversation between the two of them in the hallway. I didn't catch all of it, but I remember hearing Maggie say something about not being able to go through with it, and then Eleanor sounded quite agitated. They were always so close, but something changed that day." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was exactly what she had suspected. The distance between Maggie and Eleanor had grown deeper just before the wedding, and it had something to do with the future. But what had driven Maggie to feel so strongly? And why had she chosen to leave at the moment when everyone was expecting the greatest celebration of the year? "Do you remember anything more specific about that conversation?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward slightly. Mrs. Bates shook her head, her expression regretful. "I wish I could be of more help, Miss Marple. But all I know is that Maggie seemed to be distressed about something. I overheard her mention a promise she had made, though what that promise was I couldn't say." Miss Marple sat back, considering the information she had gathered. A promise. That word hung in the air like a silent weight. What promise had Maggie made, and why did it seem to be connected to Lady Eleanor? Could it be related to something in Maggie's past, something tied to Eleanor's family? The pieces were falling into place, but there was one final step Miss Marple needed to take: to speak to Eleanor's parents. The Waverleys were no strangers to secrets and reputation. Surely there was more to this tale than met the eye. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Bates and made her way out of Waverley Hall. As she walked toward the family's private quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that the heart of the mystery lay in the shadows of the Waverley household, just beyond the polished veneer they showed to the outside world. Lord and Lady Waverley were sitting in their drawing-room, a grand and stately room filled with expensive furniture and artwork that reflected their social standing. The air was cool, but the tension between them was palpable, even before Miss Marple had entered the room. Lady Waverlys was the first to speak, her voice sweet but laced with something more. "Miss Marple, how wonderful to see you again. I do hope there are no more concerns about the wedding, though I do understand that Maggie's absence has left us all in a state of shock." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Thank you, Lady Waverlys. I am concerned indeed. You see, I believe the circumstances surrounding Maggie's disappearance are not as straightforward as we might assume." Lord Waverlys cleared his throat and stood. "Are you suggesting that someone in this house might be involved in Maggie's disappearance?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze meeting his. "I am suggesting that the truth is not yet fully revealed. The connection between Maggie and Eleanor runs deeper than just friendship, doesn't it?" Lady Waverley's face hardened, but she quickly masked her emotions. "What exactly do you mean by that?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I believe," Miss Marple began carefully, "that Maggie was more than just a bridesmaid. I believe she held a promise, one that she could not break, and that is why she fled." Lord Waverlys stiffened. "You're talking about things you don't understand." Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Perhaps, Lord Waverlys, you would care to enlighten me." Chapter 5. Uncovering the Past. The atmosphere in Waverley Hall was thick with tension, and as Miss Marple stepped away from Lord and Lady Waverlys, she could feel the weight of their secrets pressing in on her. Their carefully controlled composure barely masked the unease that seemed to ripple through the room like an undercurrent, pushing against the quiet dignity of the grand estate. The conversation with Lady Eleanor's parents had left her with more questions than answers. Lord Waverlys had made it clear that Maggie Ellis's disappearance was not something he intended to discuss openly, but Miss Marple had seen through the carefully constructed facades. Lady Eleanor's anxiety, the hesitation in the voices of her parents, all pointed to one thing. There was a deeper connection between the bridesmaid and the bride, one that no one was willing to speak about. Miss Marple had always been adept at reading the smallest shifts in a person's demeanour, and she could sense that the Waverley family's willingness to evade the truth was deliberate. They were hiding something, but what? As Miss Marple walked back through the village, her mind continued to circle around the key points she had gathered: Maggie's disappearance, Eleanor's mounting anxiety, and the unspoken tension between the Waverleys and the missing bridesmaid. It was all beginning to fit together like pieces of a puzzle. To unravel the mystery, Miss Marple knew that the next logical step was to dig deeper into the past, specifically into the history of Lady Eleanor Waverley and Maggie Ellis's relationship. It wasn't just about a missing bridesmaid anymore. It was about a bond that had been shaped by years of hidden emotions. Maggie had been more than a simple bridesmaid to Eleanor, and Miss Marple was certain that the root of their conflict lay in a shared secret, one that no one was willing to discuss. After a brief stop at the local library, Miss Marple requested access to the Waverley family archives, a collection that held the history of one of the most influential families in Cranley St. James. Still, Waverley family's reputation was built on decades of social standing, wealth, and, most likely, secrets. The librarian, a quiet woman who had served the village for many years, seemed uneasy about Miss Marple's request. I'm afraid the family's private records aren't for public viewing, she said hesitantly. But when Miss Marple offered a gentle smile and an explanation of her interest in the Waverlys' history, the librarian relented, clearly intrigued by the detective's calm persistence. The dusty old volumes, some worn with age, sat on the library's top shelves. As Miss Marple sifted through them, she found herself drawn to the more personal accounts of the Waverley family, journals, letters, and diaries that chronicled not only the family's rise to prominence, but also the shifting relationships between family members. One particular letter caught her attention. It was addressed to Lady Eleanor's mother, dated 25 years earlier. The handwriting was elegant, but the tone was strangely cold, even for a formal letter. It was written by Eleanor's older brother, the heir to the Waverley estate, who had mysteriously disappeared some years ago. In his letter, he expressed regret about a decision he had made regarding a young woman named Maggie Ellis, the very same name that now loomed large in Miss Marple's investigation. The letter was vague, but there was one crucial line that stood out. I've done what I had to do. Maggie Ellis was never meant to be part of our world. You must understand, Eleanor. Her presence was always going to complicate things. You were never meant to share that secret with her. Miss Marple's heart quickened as the meaning of these words began to sink in. Maggie Ellis had been involved with the Waverley family long before the wedding, and not just as a servant's daughter or a common acquaintance. She had been entangled in the very fabric of their past, involved in something that had been kept hidden from the rest of the world, and the family secret was something that Lady Eleanor had carried for years, only to have it come to a head on the day of her wedding. As Miss Marple reflected on the letter, it became clear that Maggie had left the wedding not because of nerves or simple misunderstanding, but because she had uncovered the truth. She had learned the secret about the Waverley family, the secret that had been locked away for years, and when Maggie had threatened to expose it, Eleanor, caught between her loyalty to her family and her own sense of right and wrong, had seen no choice but to push Maggie away. In a quiet corner of the library, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, pondering the implications. The disappearance of Maggie was no longer just a matter of a missing bridesmaid. It was a desperate attempt to keep a hidden past buried. Maggie had become a threat, one that would have unravelled the Waverley family's carefully constructed image of perfection. Eleanor had been forced to choose between her family's reputation and the woman who had been her closest confidant. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way back to Waverley Hall, her mind racing with the new information she had uncovered. She knew that the time had come for a direct confrontation. Lady Eleanor could no longer remain silent about the truth, and Miss Marple was ready to help her face it. When Miss Marple arrived at the estate, she was met by Eleanor, who had been expecting her. The guilt in Eleanor's eyes was evident, though she tried her best to hide it behind a veneer of politeness. "Miss Marple," Eleanor greeted her, "I assume you've come to ask me more questions about Maggie." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes calm yet intense. "Yes, dear. I believe it's time we spoke of the past, the truth about Maggie Ellis and your family. You see, it's impossible to move forward until the past is confronted." Eleanor's face drained of colour as she stepped back slightly. "I don't know what you mean. Maggie left because she couldn't handle the attention, the responsibility." Her voice wavered slightly, but she quickly regained control. She wasn't meant to be part of this world. Miss Marple met Eleanor's gaze steadily. No, Eleanor, she wasn't. But she was meant to know the truth. And so are you. The promise you made to her all those years ago was never meant to be broken. But you didn't just break it, you buried it. And now Maggie is gone, and the secret she was unwilling to live with has come to light. Chapter 6. The Heart of the Secret. Miss Marple sat in the quiet drawing-room of Waverley Hall, the weight of the conversation with Lady Eleanor lingering in the air like a fragile thread that had yet to unravel completely. Eleanor had been visibly shaken by Miss Marple's observations, but there was a deeper guilt in her expression, one that was not easily brushed away. The time had come to confront the past. The pieces of the puzzle, the tensions between Eleanor and Maggie, the family secret that had been buried for years, were beginning to fit together. But there was one question left unanswered. Why had Maggie chosen to leave at this critical moment? And why had Lady Eleanor been so determined to keep the truth hidden? Lady Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, had finally agreed to speak more openly about the history she had kept so tightly guarded. Miss Marple could see that the young woman was struggling with the weight of her own choices that had led to the present chaos. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as Eleanor finally broke the silence. "I suppose it's time," Eleanor said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "You've already figured so much out, Miss Marple. There's no point in hiding any more." She paused, collecting her thoughts, and then, with a deep breath, continued. "Maggie and I have known each other for years, since we were children, but she was never meant to be in my world." Miss Marple nodded gently, encouraging her to continue. She could tell that Eleanor was struggling to find the right words. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, an emotional battle that Eleanor was only now allowing to surface. The truth was painful, and Miss Marple could see that Eleanor had been carrying it alone for far too long. "Maggie was the daughter of a servant who worked for my family," Eleanor began, her voice strained. "She was always around, always, by my side, but we were never equals. I was Lady Waverley's daughter, and Maggie was, well, she was the daughter of someone who worked for us. People like her weren't meant to be part of our world, no matter how much I wanted to include her." Eleanor's eyes flickered with pain as she spoke. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze sharp but understanding. "But it was more than that, wasn't it? There was a bond between you two, something deeper than mere friendship." Eleanor's eyes clouded with emotion. "Yes, Maggie was more than just my friend. We were close, too close in some ways, but that closeness, it wasn't something I could acknowledge publicly. My family, they would have never allowed it. There were whispers, and as I got older, it became clear that I couldn't keep her in my world. I had to choose between her and my family's expectations." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It was a story she had heard before, one of loyalty and betrayal. It was a familiar struggle, and yet the consequences of Eleanor's choice had been much more profound than either she or Maggie had realized. "So, Maggie must have learned the truth eventually," Miss Marple said softly, her voice taking on a more delicate tone. "She must have realized that you had no choice but to break her heart in order to maintain your place in the world." Eleanor's expression softened, but only just. I didn't want to hurt her. I never did. But when Maggie began to question why she wasn't included in certain things, why she was treated like she was still just the daughter of the servant, it became impossible to hide the truth. I tried to protect her from it. I thought if I gave her small pieces of my world, that it would be enough. But in the end, it wasn't. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind racing as she pieced together the details. She understood now why Maggie had left. It wasn't just the pressures of the wedding or the simple nervousness of being in the spotlight. It was the realization that Eleanor had chosen her family and status over their shared past. Eleanor's voice cracked as she continued. Maggie was never supposed to find out, Miss Marple, but she did. She overheard a conversation between my father and one of the family lawyers. And that's when she learned about the promise my family had made to hers. One that kept her in a certain place, no matter what. A promise? Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing. What promise, dear? Eleanor hesitated before answering. My father promised Maggie's family that she would always be taken care of, but only in the context of service. Maggie had a future in the Waverley household, but only as someone beneath us. That's how it was, how it always had been. And Maggie, she didn't want to accept that. The truth, as Miss Marple had suspected, was far more painful than simply a missing bridesmaid. Maggie had come to realize the harsh reality of her relationship with the Waverley family. What she had once believed was a friendship of equals was, in fact, a relationship built on obligation and secrecy. It was this realization that had pushed Maggie to flee, not out of bitterness, but out of a desperate need to escape the constraints of a life that had never truly been hers to choose. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away hastily. I never meant for Maggie to find out. I never wanted her to feel like she was trapped. But after she knew, I couldn't face her. I thought if I just kept her at arm's length, if I pretended everything was fine, she would stay. But she didn't. She left. She left because she couldn't be part of my world anymore. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her voice remained clear and direct. And you, Eleanor, did you want her to stay? Eleanor's voice trembled as she answered, Yes, I wanted her to stay more than anything. But in the end, I couldn't change who I was, or the role I was supposed to play. I couldn't give up everything for her, and I knew she couldn't stay in a world where she would always be treated as less than. Miss Marple let out a small sigh, the weight of Eleanor's words settling in the room. And now Maggie is gone, and the truth about your family's promise is no longer hidden. It's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, contemplating the complex web of guilt, duty, and love that had bound Lady Eleanor to Maggie for so many years. There was no question that Eleanor had acted out of fear of losing her position, her family's expectations, and the world she had been taught to uphold. But in doing so, she had destroyed the very thing she had loved most. But now, the truth was out. The puzzle was nearly complete, and there was only one final step left. Maggie needed to be found, but more importantly, Eleanor needed to confront her choices. There could be no moving forward until that was done. Eleanor, Miss Marple said softly, there is one thing left to do. You must face Maggie, whether she returns or not. The promise you made to her and the secrets you've kept cannot remain buried any longer. Chapter 7. Confronting the Past. The evening was descending over Cranley St. James, and the village was cloaked in the quiet that preceded dusk. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, the perfect setting for reflection. Miss Marple stood by the window of her cottage, her hands folded neatly over her lap as she gazed out at the tranquil streets. Her mind was sharp, calculating, piecing together the final moments of the mystery she had so carefully untangled. Lady Eleanor had been right to feel uneasy, for the weight of her secrets had weighed heavily on her. Now, Miss Marple was convinced that the final piece of the puzzle was not about finding Maggie Ellis. It was about Eleanor's resolution. The young woman's grief and guilt over the years had prevented her from truly living, and it was time to face her fears head-on. Miss Marple had seen this sort of thing before. The power of secrets, once they were laid bare, was that they had the ability to tear down the carefully built lives of those who hid them. For Eleanor, the choice would not be easy: face the truth, or continue living with the illusion of peace. Miss Marple had arranged to meet with Lady Eleanor the next day, and although Eleanor was hesitant, she had agreed to confront the past. But Miss Marple knew that action would have to follow reflection. Maggie Ellis was not merely a missing bridesmaid anymore. She had become a symbol of the life Eleanor could never fully embrace. A life of honesty, one that required courage and vulnerability. Early the next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village constable, Inspector Bryce, who had been diligently working on tracking down Maggie. He had not had much luck so far, as Maggie's absence was shrouded in mystery. The young woman had vanished without leaving a trace, no clues or messages behind, and the search had hit a standstill. The townsfolk were beginning to believe Maggie might have left Cranley St. James for good, but Miss Marple had a different theory. Inspector Bryce greeted her at the station with his usual politeness. He had the look of a man who had seen too many unanswered questions. His brow furrowed as he led Miss Marple into the small office at the back of the station. "Miss Marple, I'm afraid we haven't made much progress," he said, sitting down with a sigh. "The only thing we've turned up is that Maggie had no plans to leave. At least, none that she told anyone about." Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft but intent. "Have you checked the old cottage near the outskirts of the village? It's where Maggie used to live before moving in with Lady Eleanor, I believe." Bryce raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure. "That's a long shot, Miss Marple. If she left, she's likely gone far away by now." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with a quiet confidence. "It's not so much about where she's gone, Inspector. It's about where she's been, what she's left behind." She stood, her voice gentle but firm. "The truth isn't always where we expect it to be, and often the smallest signs point us in the right direction." Miss Marple and Inspector Bryce arrived at the small, weather-beaten cottage on the edge of the village, where Maggie had spent much of her earlier life. The place had long been abandoned, but it was still recognizable, its wooden exterior worn down by time, its windows dark and uninviting. Miss Marple approached the door, and with a quiet nod to Bryce, she turned the handle. It creaked open with the faintest protest. Inside, the cottage was as quiet as the world outside, the dust-covered surfaces betraying its long abandonment. Miss Marple moved with purpose, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. She noticed fragments of old photographs hanging on the walls, remnants of Maggie's life scattered here and there. But it wasn't the photographs or the faded furniture that drew Miss Marple's attention. It was the small desk by the window. Bryce approached her cautiously. "Do you think she left something behind?" Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on the desk, the papers and letters strewn across it. She moved closer, her fingers brushing over the pieces of paper, each one a faint echo of Maggie's last thoughts. "I believe she did," Miss Marple murmured. "She didn't run away in fear. She left to find answers about her past, about the truth." Bryce watched as Miss Marple carefully picked up a letter, her fingers gently unfolding the creased paper. The letter was written in Maggie's neat handwriting, though the words were desperate and filled with a conflict that only Miss Marple could read between the lines. "Eleanor, I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I've seen the things you've tried to hide. The things we both know are better left unsaid. I have to leave before it destroys us both. There's too much to lose, but I can't live with this secret anymore. Please understand." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. This was it, the reason Maggie had disappeared. She had uncovered something Eleanor could never admit, something buried deep in the past. Maggie had realized that the bond between them could never survive the weight of the truth. As they left the cottage, Bryce was quieter than usual, deep in thought. He had seen many disappearances in his time, but this was different. Maggie's disappearance wasn't about running from a crime or an immediate danger. It was about running from a truth too heavy to bear. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction as she headed back to Waverley Hall. The truth was closer now than it had ever been. She was certain that Eleanor needed to face Maggie, not to apologize, not to ask for forgiveness, but to face the truth of their shared past. When she arrived at the hall, Eleanor was waiting for her, her face anxious but determined. She had been through so much, but Miss Marple could see that Eleanor was finally ready to face the reality of what had happened. "I've learned something important today, Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently. "I've learned that the truth, no matter how much we try to bury it, always finds its way to the surface." Eleanor's face was pale, but she held herself steady. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple took a deep breath, her eyes kind but direct. "Maggie left because she could no longer live with the weight of your shared secret. It wasn't just about her place in your world, Eleanor. It was about the promise you both made, the one you didn't keep. Maggie was your closest friend, but you asked her to pretend she was something less than she was, and now she's gone, because the truth became too much to bear." Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The village of Cranley St. James was quieter than usual that evening, the gossips and the whispers now subdued as everyone carried on with their daily lives. But for Miss Marple, the quiet seemed to be filled with tension, as if the very air were pregnant with the secrets that had yet to be fully revealed. She had spent much of the afternoon in thought, piecing together the last parts of the puzzle. Lady Eleanor, now fully aware of the gravity of her choices, had agreed to meet with Maggie Ellis, the missing bridesmaid whose absence had haunted them all. Miss Marple knew that it was time for Eleanor to face Maggie, not to apologize for her mistakes, but to finally confront the truth about their shared history. Miss Marple's sharp mind had no doubt that the past could not be ignored forever. And only in the confrontation could the two women move forward. Maggie's secrets had been hidden for too long, just as Eleanor's guilt had weighed on her far too heavily. But truth had a way of unburdening people, even if the weight was unbearable at first. The meeting place was set at the edge of the village, near the old stone bridge that led to the woods. Miss Marple had suggested this spot, a quiet and peaceful location where both women could speak without interruption or the prying eyes of the village. As she made her way to the meeting point, Miss Marple noticed the changing light in the sky, the fading glow of sunset, giving way to the darker, more mysterious shades of the evening. Eleanor arrived first, her eyes betraying her uncertainty. She had worn the veil of composure well over the years, but now, with the weight of the truth pressing down on her, it seemed as though the mask was about to crack. She stood by the bridge, her posture tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple joined her moments later, offering a gentle, knowing smile. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor." The young woman didn't respond at first, but her gaze softened at Miss Marple's words. She seemed to take a deep breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "I don't know what to say to her, Miss Marple. I feel like I've lost everything." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "It's not about what you've lost, Eleanor. It's about what you're willing to face. You've carried a secret for so long. Now it's time to let it out." Before Eleanor could respond, Maggie appeared in the distance, stepping out from the shadows of the trees. She looked different than Miss Marple had imagined. Her usual nervous demeanour was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. Maggie's appearance was unkempt, as though she had been living in the wilderness for a time, but there was something else in her expression, something undeniable, the pain of a friendship betrayed. The three women stood on the edge of the bridge, the rustling of the trees in the breeze the only sound between them. Miss Marple stood slightly to the side, observing, though her presence was felt by both Eleanor and Maggie. It was clear that this was not just a meeting between two people. It was the reckoning of a shared past. Maggie looked at Eleanor, her gaze hard, but not unkind. "I didn't want to leave like that, you know," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hurt. "But I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew the truth." Eleanor swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you, Maggie. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" Maggie's eyes narrowed, and there was a sharpness to her words now. "You protected me by keeping me in the shadows, Eleanor. You protected me by making me think I was just good enough to be a friend, but not enough to be part of your world. I had to leave because I finally understood that I didn't belong in your life anymore. No matter how much I loved you, no matter how much I tried, I would always be less than." Eleanor flinched, the rawness of Maggie's words cutting deep. "I didn't think it would turn out this way. I never wanted to push you away, but I had no choice. I was never allowed to choose you. My family, my position, everything I had depended on this illusion of a perfect life. And you, Maggie, you were always a part of that illusion." Maggie shook her head, her lips tight. "But you never chose me, Eleanor. You chose everything else, your title, your family's expectations. I wasn't part of that world. And the more I realized it, the more I saw how trapped you were. You can't live like that. Not for the rest of your life. The tension between them was thick, but it was clear to Miss Marple that this was the moment when both women would have to confront the truth of their relationship, not just as friends, but as two people bound by love and by lies. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Eleanor, Maggie," she said quietly, "the past cannot be undone. The secrets have already been spoken aloud, and it's clear that both of you were trapped in a web of fear. Eleanor, you were bound by your family's expectations, and Maggie, you were bound by your loyalty to Eleanor. But the truth is, neither of you could live freely until you confronted what has been buried between you for all these years." Both women turned to Miss Marple, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice small. "But where do we go from here? How do we move on from this?" Miss Marple smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You begin by facing the truth and forgiving yourselves. You begin by understanding that neither of you was entirely at fault. It was the circumstances, the weight of your family's expectations, the fear of losing each other that kept you apart. But now you can choose to let go of those fears. You can choose each other if you wish." There was a long silence as the two women exchanged a look. Then, slowly, Eleanor took a step toward Maggie, her hand trembling but reaching out. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. You were always so important to me." Maggie looked at her, and for the first time the sharpness in her eyes softened. She reached out and took Eleanor's hand, her grip firm but warm. "I know," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry too. The moment of reconciliation had arrived. It wasn't perfect. There would still be much to sort through, much to heal. But for now, it was enough." Chapter 9. The final truth the following weeks in Cranley St. James passed in a haze of newfound normalcy, though there was something deeper beneath the surface. The wedding that had once been the talk of the village had now become a symbol of change, a moment in time that had marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The tension that had once clouded the air was gone, replaced with a quiet sense of peace. But underneath it all, Miss Marple knew the effects of what had transpired would ripple through the village for years to come. Lady Eleanor and Maggie Ellis had found a new understanding between them. Though their reunion had not been without pain, it had been necessary. They had both grown up, one learning to let go of the burden of family expectations, the other learning to forgive herself for the years of secrecy. It hadn't been an easy path, but it was one they both walked willingly, knowing that their shared history would no longer dictate their future. After the confrontation on the bridge, Maggie had returned to the village, though not immediately to the Waverley estate. She needed time to rebuild her life, to reconcile the disappointment of feeling like a mere shadow in Eleanor's world, and the anger she had carried with her for so long. For the first time in years, she was walking on her own terms, free to make her own choices. As for Eleanor, she had begun the difficult journey of accepting her family's imperfections, and more importantly, her own. The weight of her past no longer hung over her like a dark cloud, and in time she would learn to face the world without the veil of illusion that had kept her hidden from the truth. The town itself had also experienced a subtle transformation. The village had always been charming, filled with its fair share of gossips, but the air had been tinged with a new sense of openness. People no longer looked at Lady Eleanor and Maggie with the same airs of pretension or judgment. Though the Waverley name still carried weight, the villagers seemed more willing to accept the truth about their pasts. No one was perfect, and perhaps that was a lesson Cranley St. James needed to learn. Miss Marple, of course, was well aware of the shifts that had taken place. She had always believed that time had a way of revealing the true nature of things. People, she had long understood, were far more complex than they appeared on the surface, and the truth, whether willingly sought or not, always found its way to the light. One afternoon, as the days grew shorter and the sun began its descent, toward the horizon, Miss Marple made her way to the Larkspur tea-room, her favourite spot to sit and reflect. The small teapot in front of her steamed gently, the aroma of freshly brewed Earl Grey filling the air. She was content, at least for the moment, knowing that the mystery of Maggie Ellis's disappearance had come to a satisfying conclusion. As Miss Marple stirred her tea, her thoughts turned once more to the events that had unfolded. The disappearance of Maggie had set off a series of revelations that had unravelled the carefully crafted lives of Eleanor and her family. But what struck Miss Marple the most was the personal growth she had witnessed in both women. Maggie, once constrained by a life of unspoken rules and expectations, had now found her freedom, and Eleanor, though still navigating the consequences of her actions, had begun to shape a future that was no longer shackled by the past. Miss Marple had never been one to expect perfect resolutions. Life, she had come to understand, was not a neat puzzle with a simple answer. There were always pieces that didn't fit, edges that were jagged and imperfect. But that was what made the world so beautifully human. It was the imperfections that gave people depth, that allowed them to grow, to change, and to learn from their mistakes. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the door to the Larkspur tea-room opening, and in stepped Lady Eleanor. She looked different than she had at the start of the case. Her expression was softer, and the tension in her shoulders had melted away. She was no longer the same young woman who had been bound by her family's expectations, but someone who had begun to carve out her own identity. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said warmly as she made her way to the table, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Miss Marple smiled, motioning for her to sit. "Not at all, dear. It's always a pleasure to see you." Eleanor took a seat across from Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice sincere, "for helping me see the truth, for helping me understand that I didn't have to live in the shadow of my family's expectations anymore." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I know I've made many mistakes, but I'm trying to do better. Maggie and I are working things out. It's not easy, but I think we're both learning to forgive." Miss Marple nodded. "The truth has a way of changing things, dear. Sometimes it can break us down, but it also has the power to set us free. You and Maggie have faced the hard part. Now you must decide what comes next." Eleanor smiled softly, a sense of peace settling over her. "I think we're both ready for what comes next." As the weeks turned into months, the people of Cranley St. James returned to their usual routines. The wedding, which had once been the source of excitement and gossip, had faded into history. replaced by the quiet hum of daily life. Eleanor and Maggie, though they still had a long road ahead of them, were beginning to rebuild their friendship, each one facing the truths of their past and finding a way forward. Miss Marple, ever observant, knew that their journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, she sensed that both women had begun to walk their own paths, free of the burdens they had once carried. The past could no longer dictate their future. They had chosen to live freely. One evening as autumn's chill crept into the village. Miss Marple stood by the window of her cottage, watching the last light of day fade over the hills. The case was done, the mystery solved, and yet the lessons lingered in her mind. People were more than the sum of their secrets, she thought, and sometimes the greatest mystery was not what others could see, but what they chose to reveal when they were ready. As Miss Marple turned away from the window, a soft smile played across her lips. She had always known that truth had the power to heal. It was the human heart, after all, that held the greatest mysteries, and it was her greatest privilege to help others unveil them. The end of one mystery was only the beginning of another, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, was ready for whatever would come next. The story of the missing bridesmaid and the family secrets had come to an end, but the shadows of the past would never be forgotten in Cranley St. James. In the end, it wasn't just the truth of Maggie Ellis and Eleanor Waverlys that had been revealed. It was the larger truth of human nature, that no one is entirely good or bad, and that forgiveness and self-understanding are the keys to moving forward. Miss Marple's work was done for now, but she knew that the small, seemingly quiet village would always have secrets, and she would be there when the time came to unravel them.